Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to welcome you to today's lecture. And today's lecture is lecture 8 in the series of our course that you are aware of, and that is Philosophy and Leadership of Occupational Health and Safety. If you recall, over the last few weeks, we have been able to cover 3 topics. We looked at the first topic, which introduced us to the concept of environmental health and safety. From there, we continued and we discussed the ethical theories that underlie environmental health, and we attempted to link environmental health to occupational health and safety. Then we went to topic number 2, where we looked at the nature of work. And we discussed a number of things, including the various developments in the international community, like globalization, issues of feminism, issues of migrations, and so forth, and how those things impact on environmental health and safety. From there, we went to topic number 3, where we discussed various aspects that related to the economic value. We looked at the business value, and then we examined how the business, economic, and the value case relates to environmental health, and more specifically, occupational health and safety. In lecture number 7, you recall that we examined the various costs that relate to occupational health. And in those costs, we examined what we call the direct costs. We examined the indirect costs and also the intangible costs. And among the intangible costs, we did examine what we call frictional costs. And then we said that all these costs, which we call occupational related costs, have implications to the society. They have implications to the employers and implications to the employee. And then, after articulating those issues, we looked at the meso. We examined the macro and the micro-related implications of occupational health. We now delve into another important and quite interesting topic of occupational health and safety, and that is topic number 4 on your course outline. This topic number 4 is the fundamental human right to health, safety, and well-being. So our topic today, which is topic 4, is the fundamental human right to health, safety, and well-being. And in this lecture, I intend to cover a number of things, and I do not intend to really come back to this topic. So in this topic, I'll give you an introduction so that you understand what human rights are. 2, I'll introduce the concept of justice and environmental health and attempt to understand this in light of occupational health, safety, and well-being. I'll then take you through what we call policies and standards that promote human rights. And then thereafter, we shall go to how employers, how various organizations and governments recognize health, safety, and well-being as human rights. And then, lastly, we shall examine how various governments and organizations embed environmental health and safety in policy, and thereafter conclude, ladies and gentlemen. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is the outline of our lecture today. So let's now go to the first aspect of our lecture. And the first aspect of our lecture today relates to what human rights are. And unless we understand human rights, we'll never be able to put environmental health and safety into perspective, and also occupational health, safety, and well-being. Now, human rights represent the common language now of the global market. So almost everywhere, everybody is talking about human rights. And promoting and encouraging individuals and organizations to respect for to develop a respect for human rights and for freedoms for all without distinction is an important attribute of countries and organizations that have been developed over time to ensure that human rights are respected. So that is the global language, a global thought now, and therefore promoting and encouraging respect for human rights is an important aspect of organizations and countries. And you have to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms without distinction as to race, without distinction to sex, without distinction to language or region. And this is one of the major objectives of United Nations as set out in Article 1 of the United Nations Charter, which was developed in 1945. Now, while the Charter does not give content to the idea of human rights and fundamental freedoms, these have been elaborated in what we call the Universal Declarations of Human Rights, sometimes simply referred to as UDHR. And of course, the other additional 9 core treaties or international treaties that deal with specific human rights. And that information is found in the United Nations Non-Governmental Liaison Service 2008. So, human rights, ladies and gentlemen, is defined as a fundamental civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights inherent to all human beings, whatever our nationalities, whatever our places of residence, whatever the gender, whatever national or ethnic origin, whatever the race, religion, language, or any other status. And that is very important and is contained in the Office of the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights. Human rights can be seen primarily as ethical demands, and even though they often inspire legislation, this is not a constitutive characteristic of human rights. So, human rights can be primarily ethical in nature. And of course, they may or may not inspire legislation. Remember, our course is what we call the philosophy and leadership of occupational health and safety. So unless we understand human rights, as I said earlier on, we may not be able to articulate occupational issues as human rights issues, and we may not even understand why we are bothered with everything that we seem to be doing right now. So, as you can see, human rights can easily be understood as necessary conditions of political legitimacy. And they are basic requirements of social justice as well. And failing to protect human rights can have very serious consequences, as you know very well. From time to time, you've heard about conflicts in various areas and parts of the world. And these conflicts have come up as a result of people thinking that maybe our governments are not protecting the human rights of individuals. And therefore, human rights must be observed by almost every individual on this planet Earth. So, It is therefore very useful for us to start connecting now the human rights and the sustainable development goals which were passed in 2015 during the United Nations General Assembly. And there's a link between human rights and sustainable development. So it is therefore indisputable that in order to achieve sustainable development across the world, human rights are essential and have to be respected by all. And that's why you have the link here. And the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is unequivocally anchored in human rights. And that is something that you need to know and understand. And it states that sustainable development goals, these SDGs that were developed in the United Nations in 2015 and passed by the Assembly, it was observed at that stage that these SDGs aim to realize the human rights of all. And they emphasize the responsibilities of both the state and non-state actors, including the private sector. Now, if we examine these things very well, we also discover that the private sector has to respect, the private sector has to protect, and the private sector has to promote human rights as fundamental freedoms for all. Now, if we go to the SDGs and we start examining one by one, you will see exactly what I mean. And I want to invite you to go to the internet and download a document that talks about sustainable development goals, because every country now aims at promoting and implementing what was passed in the United Nations General Assembly in 2015. Now, Sustainable Development Goal 8, for example, seeks to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, which is again aligned to human rights standards. Now, of course, at the end of the day, this links human rights, sustainable development, but more specifically linking advocacy on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals to human rights as one of the most effective way of pushing for progress at the national level. So while commitments under 2030 agenda are of a political nature, human rights treaties are legally binding on the states that ratified them. And they also try to bolster advocacy demands in relation to goals and targets that correspond to human rights obligations. So, ladies and gentlemen, human rights include a number of things, and we need to know this. Human rights, for example, include labor rights, also referred to as worker rights, such as, for instance, the right to work. Right to work is a human right. The right to free choice of employment is a human right. And in fact, sometimes when you sit down and you start reflecting on what countries are doing, you discover that countries are actually denying their citizens fundamental human rights, because human rights include labor rights, and these labor rights include the right to work. So if I'm unemployed and I'm seated at home, then governments in general are denying their citizens the right to work. Governments are denying the right to free choice of employment. And these are really forces of demand and supply. At the end of the day, I should be able to find a job and work and even choose and say, I'll do this because I'm not really interested in this. So the right, for instance, to fair remuneration is an aspect of human right. The right to safe working conditions is an aspect of human rights. Ensuring a life with dignity is a human right. The right to form and join trade unions is a fundamental human right, as well as the right to rest, the right for leisure, including reasonable working hours and holidays with pay. So these are fundamental human rights, all of which have direct relevance to workers' health, safety, and well-being. And that's why we are covering occupational health and safety, where we have those three major aspects. We have health, we have safety, and we have well-being. So even though the conception of labor rights predates all human rights treaties and organizations, the human rights literature usually does not mention labor rights or even a link between those things. And that is an anomaly. Literature does not recognize labor rights as being subsumed under human rights. And that's why you need to develop an inquiring mind so that you understand where you are and what belongs to you as a worker, as an employee. For example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the founding document of the modern human rights doctrine. We also know that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations on December 10th, 1948, although not legally binding, has been very, very, very influential, as it was the first international initiative to emphasize the principle of universality of human rights, which is now the cornerstone of international human rights law. Now, initially adopted as a common standard of achievement for all people and all nations in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights today exerts significant moral, political, and legal influence. That document, as it has served directly and indirectly as a model for many domestic constitutions, it has served as a model for many domestic laws, regulations, and policies that protect fundamental human rights. Now, many of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights provisions have also become incorporated into the customary international law, which is binding on all states. And therefore, I want to invite you again to go and read those documents. I hope you'll be able to digest and relate those things to the subject that we are covering. Now, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights protects rights such as freedom of expression. So you are free to express yourself. The right to life, the prohibition of torture, and it also includes labor rights. Now, we also know that in 1966, ladies and gentlemen, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant of Economics, Social, and Cultural Rights were adopted by the United Nations. And the reason why the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights were adopted were simply to promote social progress and better standards of life. 2, to reaffirm faith in human rights. 3, employing international monitoring and enforcement mechanism to that end. Now, these 2 covenants are international human rights treaties, which create legally binding international obligations to those states and have agreed to be bound by the standards contained in them. So once you ratify and you're a member, then you are bound by those documents. The documents become legally binding. So, together with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights are often referred to as the International Bill of Rights, which constitutes an authoritative catalogue of internationally recognized human rights. And it's important for us to know where we are coming from. And we also know that universal human rights are often expressed and guaranteed by law in the forms of treaties, in the forms of customary international law, and in the forms of general principles and sources of international law. So international rights law lays down obligations of governments to act in certain ways and to refrain from certain acts, and so that at the end of the day they are able to promote and protect human rights of individuals. So, ladies and gentlemen, since we are dealing with a course that is referred to as occupational health and safety, and specifically concerned with the philosophies and leadership of occupational health and safety, allow me to talk about the economic, social, and cultural rights which are most relevant to health, safety, and well-being. And I will be talking about these things because they are those human rights which relate to the workplace. They are those human rights that relate to social security, those human rights that relate to family life, those human rights that relate to participation in cultural life, those human rights that relate to the access to housing, food, water, healthcare, and education. As we shall discuss later on, various international labor organizations, conventions, ILO conventions, various universal declaration of human rights, and international covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights protect workers' rights as well as the right to health, which also include the right to health, occupational, and environmental conditions. Therefore, for us to understand occupational health and safety, then we have to read the United Nations document and even the Sustainable Development Goals passed by United Nations during its convention in 2015. So we also know that both the International Labour Organization and World Health Organization led the recognition of these occupational health issues. So, ladies and gentlemen, allow me now to move very fast to another concept of recognizing health, safety, and well-being as human rights. So health, safety, and well-being is and do constitute and will always continue to constitute what we call human rights. Now, workers' well-being, the well-being of workers encompass workers' rights and benefits. Now, on the right side, as you can see, workers' safety, voice, and participation are very important. So there is no way you can ignore the workers' safety. There is no way you can ignore the voice of the workers. There is no way you can ignore the participation of the workers. And therefore, workers have a stake in every organization, and the workers have a stake in every community and every society. I know that various countries do fear labor movements or unions because they can be politically powerful and they can even overthrow any given government. So workers are very, very important. And if you follow them, the development of workers' unions and movements, you will see how politically powerful these movements became thereafter. And of course, if you want to be a dictator, one of the things that you have to kill, one of the things you have to destroy are the workers' movements and labor unions and so forth. So anyway, it's very important for us to recognize those things, right? And of course, at the end of the day, you will be able to achieve whatever you want to achieve as an organization. So workers' well-being has been linked to the quality of their work. The workers' well-being has been also linked to the quality of their lives. If you study a document authored by UNDP in 2015, you discover that workers' well-being is linked to quality of life as well as the quality of their lives. Now, in 2013, World Development Report exemplifies how jobs are instrumental to achieving economic and social development. And of course, beyond their critical importance for individual well-being, they lie at the heart of many broader societal objectives. And these include, for instance, poverty reduction. They include economy-wide productivity growth. They include skill acquisition. They include social cohesion and so forth. So jobs that contribute to these broader goals are valuable not only to those who hold them, but to the entire community or society as a whole. Therefore, it is not the creation of any job that is needed, but the creation of good jobs, focusing not only on quantity of jobs, but also on quality of work. So when some countries announced about 4 years ago, and they say that, you know, our country is fast, so we must have the inside-out perspective, right? Like especially what was adopted by America, having that phrase, America first, and then opening up and saying, no, we can now use coal as a source of power and so forth. Of course, many jobs were created. But the question we are asking today is, what is the quality of the jobs that were created as a result of undertaking those initiatives that were opened around that particular time? So we also know that the Organization of Economic Development framework for measuring and assessing job quality considers 3 dimensions, and that's why I'm talking about the quality of life. So they consider things like earnings quality, for example. They consider the labor market security. They consider the quality of the working environment. And these are very important because they are strongly related, strongly correlated to the quality of individual lives and their well-being. So you can't talk about occupational health without looking at the quality of the jobs that are available, because again, that has they have implications for the quality of life, that is well-being, and of course issues of health as well. So we also know from various research, ladies and gentlemen, that lack of investment in improving the quality of work can cause direct economic loss of up to between 10 and 20% of the gross national product. So we're talking about GDP. So you can lose between 10 to 20 if you don't invest in improving the quality of work. So you can have a very big problem there. So we need to invest sufficient resources in improving the quality of jobs. The other thing is that there's also an estimated loss of 4% of GDP globally due to occupational death, right? So many employees do die because of work-related ailments, diseases, and illnesses. So the linkage between health, safety, and well-being to things like poverty and long-term economic growth have been shown to be much stronger than has been generally understood. So there's a link between health, safety, and well-being to poverty and long-term economic growth of nations. And that's why we need to really think about these things. And therefore, application of human rights-based approach to the treatment of workers' health, safety, and well-being policy becomes very important and fundamental. And this could serve as an effective response to one of the most important problems facing workers in the global economy, which is characterized by the breakdown of the standard employment relationship. See, you have broken promises between the employer and the employee. So, by adopting the various international labor organization conventions and human rights, declaration and treaties, individuals, right, and I'm talking about employees here, civil society groups wherever they are, and citizens organizations can demand safer and healthier working and living conditions. What is happening today is that because the employees are not aware of their rights, the unions are also not aware, and the civil society groups are not aware, and the citizens groups are not aware of their rights. They do not actually demand safer and healthier working conditions and living conditions. So it's very important for us to think about those particular aspects. So governments need to enforce. Governments have a responsibility to take care of their citizens, so they can ensure that various organizations do comply to occupational health and safety standards. So these are really very important components that we must consider. So ladies and gentlemen, as we are nearing the end of our lecture, I want us to discuss the concept of health, safety, and well-being rights. In other words, I want us to explore the possibilities of embedding health, safety, and well-being rights in policy. And this can be done by the state actors. So it takes state actors, in this case, to embed health, safety, and well-being aspects. So the international human rights law obligations, right, of nation states require that they respect and protect the citizens. Those international human rights law obligations, those obligations mandate several nation states that have ratified the treaties to respect, to protect, and fulfill the human rights of individuals within their territory. And of course, this will include and includes things like protecting individuals against human rights abuses by third parties, including business enterprises. Business enterprises have no right to abuse the rights of employees. And of course, let me just articulate to you the guiding principles which are contained in the United Nations document, which can actually guide the enterprises, but governments taking a lead to ensure that enterprises implement these things. Now, in the United Nations document of 2011, you will discover that there are certain aspects there that we call foundation principles. Remember, these things which I'm giving you now, they will help state actors to embed health, safety, and well-being in their policies. So, If we understand that these things exist in the United Nations document, then we can pick these things and implement them. Now, under the foundation principles of the UN document of 2011, states, here we are talking about governments, must protect against human rights abuse within their territory or jurisdiction by third parties, including business enterprises. So, of course, it means that governments must take appropriate steps to prevent, investigate, and punish and redress such abuse through effective policies, legislation, and so forth. Then, again, under the foundation principles of the United States, countries or states should set out clearly the expectation that all business enterprises domiciled in their territories or jurisdiction respect human rights throughout their operations. That is under foundation principles. Now, for operational principles, these are the things that governments must do or states should do. So, under operational principles, in order to meet those foundational things that I've mentioned, it is the duty of governments or states to protect. It is the duty of states to enforce laws that are aimed at or have the effect of requiring business enterprise to respect human rights. And of course, to periodically assess and see how these businesses are operating. It is the responsibility of states then to ensure that other laws and policies governing the creation and ongoing operation of business enterprises, such as company law or corporate law, do not constrain but enable respect of human rights. It is also the responsibility of states to provide guidance to business enterprises on how to respect human rights throughout the operations. It is their responsibility. Governments have this responsibility. It is the responsibility of government to encourage and, where appropriate, require business enterprises to communicate how they will address their human rights aspects. And that's important. It is the responsibility of governments or states to take additional steps to protect against human rights abuses by business enterprises. It is a responsibility of the state to exercise adequate oversight in order to meet their international human rights obligations. And of course, at the end of the day, every business enterprise and individuals in the economy must be able to promote human rights. So states should promote respect for human rights by business enterprises with which they conduct commercial transactions. And this is possible because businesses pay taxes at the end of the day. And government has a regulatory responsibility over these businesses. Businesses must comply. It is their responsibility. But states must take action. States must take up the mantle. They must take up the initiative. States should ensure that government departments, agencies, and other state-based institutions that shape business practices are aware of and observe the state's human rights obligations when fulfilling their mandates. It is the responsibility of states to undertake all those things which are in their power and, of course, in their reach, to ensure that businesses actually do encourage the promotion of human rights. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is how state actors can embed these aspects of human rights in their policies. And here I'm referring to environmental health, safety, and well-being of the employees at the workplace. So all institutions must certainly comply with the requirements of government. As I said, this lecture was not intended to be quite lengthy. I wanted us to spend a very short time trying to understand how these international laws that we ascribe to, that we are signatories to, do affect health, safety, and well-being of employees. So let me now conclude. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, human rights are the basic requirements of global justice. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, human rights describe conditions that the public sector and private sector institutions of all nations should strive to satisfy. It is the human rights that must guide the operations of businesses. Ladies and gentlemen, in this lecture, we have also seen that the violation of human rights, the violation of those human rights, right, should be taken seriously and should not be entertained. And therefore, should command the attention of the state, the civil rights movements, and the international community. And therefore, they should be able to demand the various responsible institutions to comply in order to avoid the conflict. In this lecture, we have also seen that if a country fails to satisfy the human rights conditions, even though they were equipped to fulfill them, that country will become susceptible to outside corrective interferences. And that's why in some countries you have heard of sanctions that were placed on Iran, sanctions that were put on South Africa some time back during the apartheid period. It's because the international community thought that these countries were abusing human rights. So human rights violation was the norm or the order of the day. So in this lecture, we have also seen that if the failure to observe human rights were due to lack of resources, this could justify a requirement on others to assist. So we can appeal to the international community to assist us with the resources so that we actually implement and ensure that the human rights of individuals are promoted. Because at the end of the day, occupational health, safety and well-being of employees will also be promoted. We have also seen in this lecture that to say that human rights are universal is not to claim that they are necessarily either accepted by or acceptable to everybody given their different political and ethical beliefs, but it's for us to say that human rights are supposed to be universal in the sense that they apply or may be claimed by everyone. That's why we are talking about human rights for all. Ladies and gentlemen, in this lecture, we have also seen that there is a need to rethink current macroeconomic policy orthodox and its impact on full employment, its impact on what is needed, and that is really an important, coherent policy being developed, and it's important in achieving full employment, and it's also important in achieving decent work, whatever is needed in this case. So decent work becomes very crucial and very important. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, in this lecture, we have also seen that there's still a long way to go before health, safety, and well-being is embedded in the practices of all enterprises. However, significant steps have been taken in this direction, and through initiatives aimed at mainstreaming health, safety, and well-being. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of our lecture. I must thank you for being attentive. I must thank you for coming, and I must thank you for contributing to the debate. And here I mean the scholarly debate, where we look at human rights, justice, and environmental health, and then policies and standards to promote human rights, and also recognize health, safety, and well-being being human rights, and embedding environmental health and safety in policy, and also giving you concluding remarks. I wish you the best. Stay well, stay home, stay safe, and I want to invite you next week to our next lecture, and that will be lecture 9. This has been lecture 8. I wish you a nice time. Good day. Bye.